Question 1. Performance analysis shows that the IBM Security QRadar SIEM V7-4-3 deployment is experiencing a significant increase in event processing latency, leading to delayed threat detection. The security operations team is concerned about potential security gaps. Which of the following approaches is the most professional and effective for addressing this issue? Option A. Temporarily disable a significant number of low-priority security rules to reduce the processing load and observe if latency improves. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the QRadar event flow, rule execution, and resource utilization on all relevant appliances to identify specific bottlenecks before implementing any changes. Option C. Focus solely on increasing the network bandwidth between log sources and the QRadar console, assuming the issue is solely related to data ingestion volume. Option D. Immediately escalate to IBM support for a full system diagnostic and potential hardware replacement, as performance degradation often indicates underlying hardware issues. The correct answer is D. Immediately escalate to IBM support for a full system diagnostic and potential hardware replacement, as performance degradation often indicates underlying hardware issues. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployment where initial performance metrics do not align with expected outcomes. The professional challenge lies in accurately diagnosing the root cause of performance degradation without overreacting or implementing solutions that are not data-driven. It requires a systematic approach to problem solving, balancing technical understanding with the need to maintain operational integrity and compliance. The pressure to quickly resolve performance issues can lead to hasty decisions, potentially impacting security posture or incurring unnecessary costs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a methodical investigation of the QRadar SIEM deployment's components and their interactions. This includes analyzing log sources, event processing rates, rule execution efficiency, and resource utilization, CPU memory disk I/O, on the relevant appliances. By correlating performance metrics with specific QRadar functionalities and configurations, the administrator can pinpoint bottlenecks. For example, if event rates are high but rule execution is slow, the focus shifts to rule optimization. If event collection is the bottleneck, it points to network issues or log source configuration. This data-driven, systematic approach ensures that solutions are targeted and effective, aligning with best practices for maintaining a secure and efficient security operations center. It also implicitly supports regulatory compliance by ensuring the SIEM is functioning as intended to detect and respond to threats. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately assume a hardware failure and initiate costly hardware replacements without thorough diagnostic testing. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses essential troubleshooting steps, leading to unnecessary expenditure and potential disruption if the issue is software or configuration related. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence and responsible resource management. Another incorrect approach is to indiscriminately disable security rules or features to improve performance. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Disabling rules can create blind spots in threat detection, directly compromising the organization's security posture and potentially violating compliance mandates that require specific detection capabilities. It prioritizes performance over security, which is fundamentally contrary to the purpose of a SIEM. A third incorrect approach is to solely rely on vendor support without performing any initial internal diagnostics. While vendor support is crucial, a professional administrator should always conduct preliminary investigations to gather relevant data. Without this, the vendor may not have sufficient information to diagnose the problem efficiently, leading to prolonged resolution times and potentially misdiagnosed issues. This reflects a lack of proactive problem solving and can be seen as an abdication of professional responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes data-driven analysis and systematic troubleshooting. This framework typically involves 1. Problem identification. Clearly define the observed performance issue. 2. Information gathering, collect relevant logs, metrics, and configuration details. 3. Hypothesis generation, formulate potential causes based on the gathered information. 4. Testing and validation, systematically test hypotheses by isolating variables and observing results. 5. Solution implementation. Apply the most effective and least disruptive solution. 6. Verification. Confirm that the implemented solution has resolved the issue without introducing new problems. 7. Documentation. Record the problem, troubleshooting steps, and resolution for future reference and knowledge sharing. This iterative process ensures that decisions are informed, efficient, and aligned with both technical best practices and organizational objectives. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a high-severity alert indicating potential unauthorized access to sensitive customer data, but the security operations team is currently handling 2 other critical incidents. Which of the following is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the QRadar SIEM administrator? Option A. Escalate the new alert directly to senior management for immediate decision-making without any prior validation. Option B. Temporarily suppress the new alert and focus solely on resolving the 2 ongoing critical incidents. Option C. Immediately initiate a full forensic investigation of the new alert to ensure no data has been exfiltrated. Option D. Perform a rapid initial validation of the new alert to assess its credibility and potential impact before deciding on further action. Correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a full forensic investigation of the new alert to ensure no data has been exfiltrated. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity operations where a critical security alert requires immediate attention, but the available resources are stretched thin. The urgency of a potential data breach, indicated by the high-severity alert, clashes with the need for thorough investigation and adherence to established incident response procedures. The pressure to act quickly must be balanced against the risk of misinterpreting the alert, leading to unnecessary disruption or, worse, overlooking a genuine threat. This requires a nuanced decision-making process that prioritizes actions based on risk and impact, while remaining within the operational and regulatory boundaries of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. Deployment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, risk-based prioritization of incident response activities. This aligns with best practices in Security Operations Center, SOC, operations, and the principles of effective incident management, which are implicitly supported by the operational guidelines for deploying and managing IBM Security QRadar SIEM. By first verifying the alert's validity and assessing its potential impact against established criteria, the security team ensures that resources are directed towards the most critical threats. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of false positives causing operational disruption and maximizes the chances of effectively mitigating a genuine incident. It reflects a mature security posture, where incident response is not reactive, but a structured process driven by intelligence and risk assessment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately escalate the alert to the highest level without initial validation. This can lead to wasted senior management time and resources on false positives, potentially delaying responses to genuine, albeit lower priority, incidents. It bypasses crucial initial triage steps that are fundamental to efficient incident handling and can be seen as a failure to apply due diligence in resource allocation, which could have indirect regulatory implications if it leads to a delayed response to a significant breach. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the alert due to a perceived lack of immediate resources. This is a direct abdication of responsibility and a significant failure to adhere to the core purpose of a SIEM system. It creates a critical gap in security monitoring and incident detection, leaving the organization vulnerable to potentially severe breaches. This approach directly violates the implicit regulatory expectation of maintaining a vigilant security posture and responding to credible threats, which is a cornerstone of data protection and cybersecurity compliance. A third incorrect approach is to attempt a full, in-depth investigation of every high-severity alert immediately, regardless of initial validation. While thoroughness is important, this can be inefficient and lead to alert fatigue and burnout. It fails to acknowledge the need for a tiered response strategy, where initial triage and validation inform the depth of subsequent investigation. This can also lead to delays in addressing other critical issues, as the team becomes bogged down in a single, potentially non-critical investigation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a structured, risk-based approach to incident response. This involves 1. Initial triage and validation. Quickly assess the alert's credibility and potential impact using available QRadar data and context. 2. Impact assessment. Determine the potential business and regulatory consequences of the suspected incident. 3. Prioritization. Rank the incident based on its validated risk and potential impact. 4. Resource allocation. Assign appropriate resources based on the incident's priority. 5. Escalation and communication. Follow established protocols for escalating and communicating the incident to relevant stakeholders. This framework ensures that actions are proportionate to the risk, resources are used efficiently, and regulatory obligations are met through a systematic and defensible process. Question 3. Analysis of the strategic decision-making process for prioritizing log source ingestion into IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. When faced with finite processing capacity and the need to maximize threat detection effectiveness. Option A. Ingest all available log sources immediately to ensure no potential security event is missed, regardless of the impact on SIEM performance or data analysis capabilities. Option B. Select log sources primarily based on requests from different business units, ensuring all departments have their data represented in the SIEM. Option C. Prioritize log sources based on a comprehensive risk assessment, focusing on those that provide the most critical security context and indicators of compromise, and implement a phased ingestion strategy. Option D. Prioritize log sources based on the ease of technical integration and the volume of data they generate, as more data generally equates to better security coverage. Correct answer is C. Prioritize log sources based on a comprehensive risk assessment, focusing on those that provide the most critical security context and indicators of compromise, and implement a phased ingestion strategy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployment, balancing the need for comprehensive threat detection with the practical constraints of resource allocation and potential performance impact. The challenge lies in making an informed decision about which log sources to prioritize for ingestion into IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. When faced with limited processing capacity. A hasty or uninformed decision can lead to either missed critical security events or an overloaded system, both of which have significant operational and security implications. The need for careful judgment stems from the direct impact on the organization's ability to detect, investigate, and respond to security incidents effectively. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a risk-based prioritization of log sources. This aligns with best practices in security operations and is implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that mandate effective security monitoring and incident response. By focusing on log sources that provide the most critical security context and are most likely to contain indicators of compromise IOC or evidence of policy violation, the organization maximizes the value of its SIEM investment. This approach ensures that high-priority threats are detected promptly, while lower-priority logs can be addressed as resources become available or through alternative, less resource-intensive methods. This demonstrates a mature security posture, prioritizing resources where they will have the greatest impact on risk reduction, a key tenet of many cybersecurity regulations. Incorrect approach is analysis. Prioritizing log sources solely based on the ease of integration or the sheer volume of data they generate is a flawed approach. This can lead to the ingestion of a large quantity of low-value, noisy data, which can obscure critical security events and overwhelm the SIEM analytical capabilities. This failure to prioritize based on security risk can be seen as a dereliction of duty in maintaining an effective security monitoring system, potentially violating regulatory requirements for diligent security oversight. Another incorrect approach is to ingest all available logs without any form of prioritization or filtering. While seemingly comprehensive, this often leads to a data lake of unmanageable proportions, where valuable security insights are lost in the noise. This can result in delayed incident detection and response, which can have severe consequences and may not meet the reasonable security measures expected under various regulatory frameworks. It also represents a significant waste of resources and can negatively impact the performance of the SIEM, hindering its primary function. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize log sources based on departmental requests rather than a security-centric risk assessment. While stakeholder input is important, security should be the primary driver for SIEM log source selection. Ignoring security criticality in favor of departmental convenience can lead to gaps in threat visibility and an inability to effectively monitor for sophisticated attacks, potentially failing to meet regulatory obligations for comprehensive security monitoring. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment. This involves identifying critical assets, potential threats, and the types of logs that would provide the most valuable intelligence for detecting and responding to those threats. A phased approach to log source ingestion, starting with the highest priority sources and gradually incorporating others as capacity allows, is recommended. Regular review and tuning of log source priorities based on evolving threat landscapes and organizational needs are also crucial. This iterative process ensures that the SIEM remains an effective tool for security operations and compliance. Question 4. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive understanding of potential security risks and their implications. When planning the deployment of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4, 3, what approach to impact assessment best balances thoroughness with the need for timely implementation and effective risk mitigation? Option A. Undertake a superficial, high-level assessment that only considers the most obvious and widely publicized cyber threats. Option B. Focus exclusively on identifying and assessing technical vulnerabilities within the network infrastructure, disregarding business process impacts. Option C. Perform an exhaustive, in-depth analysis of every conceivable threat scenario and asset vulnerability before any deployment activities commence. Option D. Conduct a phased impact assessment, prioritizing critical assets and high-probability/high-impact threats, allowing for iterative refinement as the deployment progresses. The correct answer is D. Conduct a phased impact assessment, prioritizing critical assets and high-probability/high-impact threats, allowing for iterative refinement as the deployment progresses. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity deployments, balancing the immediate need for robust security with the practical realities of resource constraints and evolving threat landscapes. The professional challenge lies in conducting an impact assessment that is both thorough enough to identify critical vulnerabilities and potential consequences, yet agile enough to inform timely decision-making without becoming a bottleneck. Overly broad or overly narrow assessments can lead to misallocation of resources, missed threats, or unnecessary delays, all of which have significant implications for organizational security posture and compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased and risk-based impact assessment. This methodology prioritizes critical assets and potential threats, allowing for a focused evaluation of the most significant risks. By identifying high-impact scenarios first, the assessment can guide the deployment of QRadar SIEM to address the most pressing security concerns efficiently. This aligns with best professional practices by ensuring that security investments are directed where they are most needed, maximizing the return on investment in terms of risk reduction. From a regulatory perspective, this approach supports compliance with frameworks that mandate risk management and the protection of sensitive data by demonstrating a systematic and prioritized approach to security. It allows for continuous refinement as new threats emerge or organizational priorities shift, fostering an adaptive security posture. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial, high-level assessment that only considers the most obvious threats. This fails to identify subtle but potentially devastating attack vectors or the cascading effects of a breach on interconnected systems. Ethically, this is a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting organizational assets and data. Could also lead to regulatory noncompliance if specific data protection requirements are not adequately addressed due to a lack of detailed understanding. Another incorrect approach is to attempt an exhaustive, in-depth assessment of every conceivable threat and asset before any deployment begins. This analysis paralysis can consume excessive time and resources, delaying the deployment of QRadar SIEM and leaving the organization vulnerable for an extended period. This is professionally inefficient and can be seen as a failure to manage project timelines effectively. It also risks the assessment becoming outdated before it is even completed, rendering its findings less relevant. A third incorrect approach is to solely focus on technical vulnerabilities without considering the business impact. While technical flaws are important, understanding how a compromise would affect business operations, reputation, and regulatory standing is crucial for prioritizing remediation efforts. This narrow focus can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing technical issues that have minimal real-world consequence while neglecting those with significant business implications. This is a failure to align security with business objectives, a key tenet of effective cybersecurity strategy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach impact assessments by first understanding the organization's critical assets, business processes, and regulatory obligations. This foundational understanding allows for the development of a risk matrix that prioritizes threats based on their likelihood and potential impact. The assessment should then be iterative, starting with the highest priority risks and progressively delving deeper as needed. Collaboration with business stakeholders is essential to ensure that the assessment accurately reflects business impact. Regular review and updates to the assessment are also critical to maintain its relevance in a dynamic threat environment. Question 5. System analysis indicates that the deployment of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 is scheduled to commence next week. To ensure a smooth transition and maintain operational integrity, what is the most critical preparatory step to undertake before initiating the deployment? Option A. Gather informal feedback from a few key IT personnel regarding their perceived impact of the QRadar deployment. Option B. Focus exclusively on configuring the core QRadar functionalities and ignore integration with existing security tools until post-deployment. Option C. Proceed with the deployment immediately, relying on the technical expertise of the deployment team to address any issues as they arise. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all affected systems, potential risks, and necessary mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all affected systems, potential risks, and necessary mitigation strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity deployments where a new security solution, IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3, is being implemented. Professional challenge lies in ensuring that the deployment process itself does not inadvertently create new vulnerabilities or negatively impact existing critical business operations. An impact assessment is crucial to proactively identify potential risks, understand the scope of changes, and plan mitigation strategies before the deployment commences. Failure to conduct a thorough impact assessment can lead to unexpected downtime, data loss, compliance violation, and a compromised security posture, all of which have significant financial and reputational consequences. The complexity arises from the interconnectedness of IT systems and the potential for unforeseen dependencies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that meticulously documents the intended changes, identifies all affected systems and processes, analyzes potential risks to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and outlines mitigation and contingency plans. This aligns with best practices in IT governance and risk management, which are implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks mandating due diligence in system changes. For instance, in a U.S. context, regulations like NIST SB 800-53, Security and Privacy Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations, emphasize the importance of impact analysis for security controls and system changes to ensure the protection of federal information and information systems. A thorough assessment ensures that the QRadar deployment is aligned with the organization's security objectives and compliance requirements, minimizing disruption and maximizing the effectiveness of the new SIEM solution. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the deployment without a formal impact assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential risks, which could violate principles of responsible system management. This approach bypasses critical risk identification and mitigation steps, potentially leading to breaches of data confidentiality or integrity, and service unavailability, which are direct contraventions of many data protection and cybersecurity regulations, e.g., GDPR in Europe, CCPA in California, HIPAA in the U.S. for healthcare data. Focusing solely on the technical configuration of QRadar without considering its integration with existing infrastructure and business processes is another failure. This narrow focus ignores the broader operational and security implications. It risks creating compatibility issues, performance degradation, or gaps in security coverage that could be exploited. thereby failing to meet the overarching security objectives and potentially violating compliance mandates that require a holistic approach to security. Relying on anecdotal evidence or informal discussions about potential impacts is professionally unacceptable. This approach lacks the rigor and documentation required for effective risk management and compliance. It is subjective, prone to bias, and does not provide an auditable trail of due diligence, which is often a requirement for regulatory compliance and internal governance. Such an approach can lead to overlooked critical risks, making the organization vulnerable and non-compliant. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, risk-based approach to system deployments. This involves 1. Understanding the organizational context. Identify critical business functions and the IT systems that support them. 2. Defining the scope of the change. Clearly articulate what the QRadar deployment entails. 3. Identifying stakeholders. Engage all relevant parties, including IT operations, security, compliance, and business units. 4. Conducting a thorough risk assessment. Systematically identify potential threats and vulnerabilities associated with the deployment. 5. Performing an impact analysis. Quantify the potential consequences of identified risks on business operations, data, and compliance. 6. Developing mitigation and contingency plans. Outline steps to reduce risks and respond to incidents. 7. Documenting the entire process. Maintain a clear record of the assessment, decision, and plans for audit and review. This systematic process ensures that deployments are managed responsibly, risks are minimized, and compliance is maintained. Question 6. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive understanding of how a deployed IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3 solution will directly support and demonstrate adherence to specific regulatory mandates relevant to the organization's operational jurisdiction. Which of the following deployment strategies best aligns with this principle for achieving and maintaining regulatory compliance? Option A. Implement only the most basic logging and event collection features in QRadar that are explicitly mentioned in the most commonly cited regulatory documents to minimize deployment complexity and cost. Option B. Conduct a thorough analysis of all applicable regulatory frameworks and map QRadar's logging, alerting, and reporting functionalities to the specific control objectives and data protection requirements mandated by those regulations. Option C. Deploy QRadar with a focus on the default configurations recommended by IBM, as these are designed to meet general security best practices and are likely to cover most compliance needs. Option D. Prioritize implementing QRadar features that offer the most advanced threat detection capabilities, assuming these will inherently satisfy all regulatory logging and monitoring requirements. The correct answer is D. Prioritize implementing QRadar features that offer the most advanced threat detection capabilities, assuming these will inherently satisfy all regulatory logging and monitoring requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity compliance, balancing the need for robust security controls with the operational realities and resource constraints of an organization. The C1000-140 exam focuses on IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3 deployment, implying a context where organizations are implementing or managing a SIEM solution to meet regulatory obligations. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying regulatory requirements to a specific technical implementation, ensuring that the chosen approach not only meets the letter of the law, but also provides effective security without undue burden. The pressure to demonstrate compliance to auditors, while also ensuring the SIEM is practical and effective for the security team, creates a complex decision-making environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory frameworks applicable to the organization's industry and geographic location. This involves mapping QRadar's capabilities and deployment configurations directly to the mandates of these regulations. For instance, if the organization is subject to PCI DSS, the approach would focus on QRadar's ability to log, monitor, and alert on activities related to cardholder data, ensuring log retention periods and access controls meet the standard. Similarly, for HIPAA, the focus would be on protecting electronic protected health information, E5. This approach ensures that the SIEM deployment is not just a technical implementation, but a strategic tool for achieving demonstrable compliance, minimizing audit findings, and reducing the risk of regulatory penalties. It leverages the QRadar platform's features to proactively address compliance requirements, rather than reactively trying to fit the technology to the regulations after the fact. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing QRadar solely based on vendor recommendations without a clear understanding of specific regulatory mandates is a significant failure. While vendor best practices are valuable, they are often generic and may not align with the precise requirements of a particular industry or jurisdiction. This approach risks overlooking critical compliance controls, leading to audit failures and potential penalties. Deploying QRadar with a focus only on the most advanced, feature-rich configurations, without considering the organization's actual compliance needs and resource capabilities, is also problematic. This can lead to an overly complex and expensive deployment that doesn't effectively address the core regulatory obligations, wasting resources, and potentially hindering the security team's ability to manage the system efficiently. Adopting a minimum viable deployment strategy that only addresses the most basic logging requirements, without a comprehensive review of all applicable regulations, is another failure. This approach is reactive and assumes that minimal effort will suffice, which is rarely the case in regulated environments. It fails to proactively identify and mitigate all compliance risks, leaving the organization vulnerable to noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM deployment for regulatory compliance by first identifying all applicable regulatory frameworks, e.g., GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, PCI DSS, SOX, NIST frameworks relevant to the jurisdiction. This is followed by a detailed mapping of QRadar's functionalities to the specific control objectives and requirements within those frameworks. A risk-based approach is crucial, prioritizing the most critical compliance areas. Collaboration with legal, compliance, and internal audit teams is essential to ensure a shared understanding of requirements and the chosen implementation strategy. Regular review and updates to the deployment based on evolving regulations and business needs are also paramount. Question 7. Compliance review shows that the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4.3 deployment is collecting logs from critical financial transaction systems, but the configured retention period for these logs is significantly shorter than the period mandated by the relevant financial services regulatory framework for audit and forensic purposes. Additionally, access controls to these historical logs are not granular enough to meet the principle of least privilege. What is the most appropriate course of action to address these findings? Option A. Immediately reconfigure all log sources to the maximum retention period allowed by QRadar and implement strict role-based access controls for all historical log data, followed by thorough testing and validation. Option B. Advise the business units to manually archive critical transaction logs to an independent storage solution to meet retention requirements, while QRadar's retention remains unchanged for performance reasons. Option C. Document the compliance findings and schedule a review of the log retention and access control policies for the next quarterly security review cycle, assuming current threat detection capabilities are not compromised. Option D. Update the log source configurations to meet the minimum required retention period specified by the Financial Services Regulatory Framework and implement granular access controls, prioritizing systems with the highest risk of audit failure, and conduct phased testing. The correct answer is A. Immediately reconfigure all log sources to the maximum retention period allowed by QRadar and implement strict role-based access controls for all historical log data, followed by thorough testing and validation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployments where the initial configuration, driven by perceived immediate needs, may not align with long-term compliance objectives. The challenge lies in balancing the urgency of threat detection with the meticulous requirements of data retention and auditability mandated by regulatory frameworks. The pressure to demonstrate immediate security value can lead to shortcuts that compromise future compliance, requiring a careful judgment call on how to rectify the situation without disrupting ongoing security operations or incurring significant rework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased remediation strategy. This aligns with best professional practice by acknowledging the existing operational context while prioritizing the correction of compliance gaps. Specifically, it involves 1. identifying and documenting the specific compliance requirements related to log source data retention and access controls. 2. Developing a detailed plan to reconfigure log source configurations to meet these requirements, including adjusting retention policies and access permissions. 3. Implementing these changes in a controlled manner, potentially during scheduled maintenance windows, to minimize operational impact. 4. Thoroughly testing and validating the changes to ensure both compliance and continued effective threat detection. This approach is justified by regulatory principles that emphasize proactive compliance management, data integrity, and auditable processes. For instance, regulations often require that logs are retained for a specified period, and that access to these logs is restricted to authorized personnel, with an audit trail of who accessed what and when. A phased approach ensures these requirements are met systematically. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply ignore the compliance findings, assuming that the current log collection is sufficient for threat detection and that compliance issues can be addressed later. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates principles of data governance and auditability, potentially leading to non-compliance penalties. It also demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility in addressing identified risks. Another incorrect approach is to immediately and drastically alter log source configurations without proper planning or testing. This could lead to the loss of critical security event data, rendering the SIEM ineffective for threat detection and incident response, and also potentially violating retention requirements by discarding data prematurely. This approach fails to consider the operational impact and the need for a controlled, validated change process, which is a cornerstone of IT governance and security best practices. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on meeting the minimum retention period without considering the granularity or context of the logs required for a comprehensive audit or forensic investigation. This might technically meet a retention requirement, but fails to provide the necessary depth of information, which is often an implicit or explicit requirement for regulatory compliance and effective security posture. This demonstrates a superficial understanding of compliance, prioritizing form over substance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory mandates applicable to their organization's industry and jurisdiction. This involves consulting relevant compliance frameworks and legal counsel. Next, a risk assessment should be performed to prioritize remediation efforts based on the severity of the compliance gap and its potential impact. A structured change management process, including impact analysis, planning, testing, and validation, is crucial for implementing any corrective actions. Continuous monitoring and periodic audits are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes. The decision-making process should always prioritize data integrity, security, and auditable processes, ensuring that the SIEM deployment serves both operational security and regulatory obligations effectively. Question 8. The evaluation methodology shows that a financial services organization is implementing IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. The primary objective is to enhance threat detection and meet regulatory compliance mandates. The organization has a vast array of IT assets, including on-premises servers, cloud-based applications, and endpoints. The security team is debating the scope of log collection for QRadar, which approach to log source selection and configuration best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for such an organization. Option A. Collect logs from every available system and application within the organization's IT infrastructure to ensure no potential security event is missed, regardless of resource implications. Option B. Prioritize log sources that provide visibility into critical business applications, sensitive data repositories, and network perimeters, and are essential for meeting specific regulatory requirements, while also considering the organization's threat landscape. Option C. Implement a phased approach where only basic network device logs are collected initially, with the intention of adding more complex log sources only if a specific security incident occurs. Option D. Focus exclusively on collecting logs from systems explicitly mentioned in the primary regulatory compliance checklist, assuming this covers all necessary security monitoring. The correct answer is B. Prioritize log sources that provide visibility into critical business applications, sensitive data repositories, and network perimeters, and are essential for meeting specific regulatory requirements, while also considering the organization's threat landscape. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for comprehensive security monitoring with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the potential for alert fatigue. The core difficulty lies in determining the optimal scope of log collection for IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. Without compromising regulatory compliance or operational efficiency. Careful judgment is required to avoid overcollection, which can lead to performance issues and increased costs, or undercollection, which can result in missed critical security events and non-compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principle of risk-based security. By prioritizing log sources that are critical for detecting threats relevant to the organization's specific threat landscape and regulatory obligations, it ensures that QRadar is effectively utilized. This approach is justified by common security frameworks and regulatory expectations that mandate the collection of logs necessary to detect and respond to security incidents. For example, in many jurisdictions, regulations require organizations to maintain audit trails and monitor for suspicious activities, necessitating the collection of logs from systems that handle sensitive data or are critical to business operations. This method also directly supports the principle of least privilege in data collection, focusing resources on what is most important. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on collecting all available logs without a clear strategy is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to significant data storage costs, increased processing overhead on the QRadar appliance, and a high volume of irrelevant alerts, contributing to alert fatigue among security analysts. This failure can have regulatory implications if the sheer volume of data prevents timely detection of actual security incidents, thereby failing to meet the spirit, if not the letter, of compliance requirements that mandate effective monitoring. Another incorrect approach, collecting only logs from systems that are explicitly mandated by a single, narrow regulation, is also professionally deficient. This overlooks the broader threat landscape and the potential for sophisticated attacks that may not be directly addressed by a single compliance checklist. It creates blind spots in security visibility, increasing the risk of undetected breaches and failing to meet the overarching goal of comprehensive security. This approach can be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting organizational assets. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment. This begins with identifying critical assets and sensitive data. Next, it involves understanding the organization's specific threat model and the types of attacks it is most likely to face. Concurrently, all applicable regulatory and compliance requirements must be thoroughly understood. Based on this, a prioritized list of log sources should be developed, focusing on those that provide the most valuable security intelligence for detecting and responding to relevant threats and meeting compliance obligations. Regular review and tuning of log collection policies are essential to adapt to evolving threats and regulatory landscapes. Question 9. Which approach would be most appropriate for deploying IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7? 4. 3. In a U.S.-regulated financial institution to enhance security monitoring capabilities while minimizing operational disruption. Option A. Implement a phased deployment strategy, starting with critical security use cases and gradually expanding coverage, accompanied by rigorous testing and stakeholder validation at each stage. Option B. Prioritize the implementation of the most technically advanced and feature-rich QRadar modules first, regardless of immediate operational impact or specific threat priorities. Option C. Focus solely on configuring QRadar for log collection and alerting, deferring comprehensive threat detection rule tuning and incident response playbook integration until after the initial deployment is complete. Option D. Deploy all QRadar SIEM features simultaneously across the entire infrastructure in a single Big Bang event to achieve immediate comprehensive coverage. The correct answer is A. Implement a phased deployment strategy, starting with critical security use cases and gradually expanding coverage, accompanied by rigorous testing and stakeholder validation at each stage. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical need to balance security posture enhancement with the operational continuity of a regulated financial institution. The chosen approach must not only align with IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4. 3. Deployment best practices, but also adhere strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial services in the United States, specifically focusing on data protection and incident response mandates. The difficulty lies in implementing robust security measures without causing undue disruption to critical business function, which could have significant financial and reputational consequences. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased, risk-based deployment strategy. This method ensures that critical security controls are implemented first, addressing the most significant threats, while allowing for controlled testing and validation in a production environment. This aligns with regulatory expectations for proactive security management and demonstrates due diligence in protecting sensitive financial data. By involving stakeholders and conducting thorough testing, it minimizes the risk of operational disruption, a key concern for financial institutions subject to stringent uptime and availability requirements. This approach also facilitates compliance with regulations like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, and the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. By ensuring that security measures are effective and do not compromise data integrity or availability. An incorrect approach that involves a big bang deployment without adequate testing or phased rollout would be professionally unacceptable. This would represent a failure to adequately assess and mitigate risks associated with a complex system deployment in a regulated environment. Such an approach could lead to unforeseen system outages, data corruption, or security vulnerabilities, directly contravening regulatory obligations to maintain secure and reliable systems. This could result in significant fines and reputational damage, violating principles of professional responsibility and fiduciary duty. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on the most advanced features of QRadar without considering the immediate threat landscape and the organization's specific risk profile, would also be professionally unsound. This demonstrates a lack of strategic alignment and potentially misallocates resources. It could lead to a deployment that is overly complex, difficult to manage, and fails to address the most pressing security concerns, thereby not meeting the spirit or letter of regulatory requirements for effective risk management. A third incorrect approach, neglecting comprehensive user training and documentation prior to deployment, would be a critical oversight. This would lead to inefficient use of the QRadar SIEM, increased risk of misconfiguration, and a delayed ability to effectively respond to security incidents. This failure to equip personnel with the necessary knowledge and tools undermines the overall security posture and can be seen as a dereliction of duty in a regulated environment where skilled personnel are essential for maintaining compliance and security. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, stakeholder engagement, and a phased implementation plan. Professionals must understand the specific regulatory landscape, identify critical assets and data, and prioritize deployment activities based on risk reduction and operational impact. Continuous monitoring, testing, and adaptation are crucial throughout the deployment lifecycle to ensure ongoing effectiveness and compliance. Question 10. The review process indicates that the QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 deployment is experiencing performance degradation and high storage utilization. The initial implementation phase involved integrating a broad range of log sources from various network devices, servers, and applications without a clear prioritization strategy. To address the current issues and optimize the SIEM effectiveness, what is the most appropriate next step for the security team? Option A. Prioritize log sources that generate the highest volume of events, as these are likely to contain the most security-relevant information. Option B. Conduct a risk-based assessment to identify and prioritize log sources that provide the most critical security telemetry relevant to the organization's threat landscape and compliance requirements. Option C. Immediately ingest all remaining available log sources to ensure comprehensive data coverage, as more data generally equates to better security. Option D. Focus on integrating log sources that are easiest to configure and require minimal effort, as this will quickly expand the SIEM data ingestion capabilities. Correct answer is B. Conduct a risk-based assessment to identify and prioritize log sources that provide the most critical security telemetry relevant to the organization's threat landscape and compliance requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployments. balancing the need for comprehensive threat detection with the practical constraints of data volume, storage, and processing power. The challenge lies in identifying the most critical log sources that will provide the highest fidelity for detecting security incidents relevant to the organization's risk profile, without overwhelming the QRadar system or incurring excessive costs. A hasty or incomplete approach can lead to blind spots in security monitoring or inefficient resource utilization, both of which have significant operational and compliance implications. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, risk-based prioritization of log sources. This aligns with best practices for SIEM deployment and management, emphasizing the principle of detecting what matters. By focusing on log sources that directly contribute to identifying threats against critical assets and business processes, the organization ensures that QRadar is optimized for its primary purpose: security incident detection and response. This approach is professionally sound because it is data-driven, aligned with business objectives, and cost-effective. It also implicitly supports regulatory compliance by ensuring that the most relevant security events are captured and analyzed, which is often a requirement for incident reporting and auditing. Incorrect approaches analysis, including all available log sources without prior analysis, is professionally unacceptable because it leads to data overload, increased storage and processing costs, and a dilution of focus on critical security events. This shotgun approach can result in missed alerts due to system performance degradation or noise. It also fails to demonstrate due diligence in resource management and strategic SIEM planning. Prioritizing log sources solely based on ease of integration or vendor recommendations, without considering their security relevance to the organization, is also professionally flawed. This can lead to the inclusion of low-value data while omitting critical security telemetry. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the organization's specific threat landscape and risk appetite, potentially leaving significant security gaps. Focusing exclusively on log sources that generate the largest volume of data, irrespective of their security value, is a misallocation of resources. High-volume, low-security value logs can consume significant SIEM capacity, impacting the system's ability to process and analyze truly critical security events. This approach is inefficient and does not align with the core objective of effective threat detection. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM log source prioritization by first understanding the organization's critical assets, business processes, and regulatory compliance obligations. This understanding informs a risk assessment to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities. Based on this, a prioritized list of log sources should be developed, focusing on those that provide the most relevant telemetry for detecting these threats. This process should involve collaboration with IT operations, security teams, and business stakeholders. Regular review and tuning of log source inclusion are essential to adapt to evolving threats and business needs. Question 11. The analysis reveals that a newly deployed IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 environment is ingesting logs from various critical systems, including customer relationship management, CRM, platforms, and financial transaction databases, without a prior comprehensive data classification or anonymization strategy. The deployment team prioritized immediate visibility into potential security threats across all systems. Given the regulatory landscape concerning data privacy, which of the following approaches best aligns with best professional practice and regulatory compliance for this QRadar deployment? Option A. Conduct a thorough data classification exercise to identify all personal and sensitive data within the ingested logs. Implement appropriate anonymization or pseudonymization techniques for such data, and then refine access controls based on the classified and protected data. Option B. Proceed with the current ingestion strategy, focusing on threat detection, and plan to address data privacy concerns in a future, separate project after the SIEM has proven its value in threat detection. Option C. Immediately implement granular role-based access controls for all ingested logs to restrict access to sensitive customer and financial data, assuming that security controls will mitigate privacy risks. Option D. Configure QRadar to only ingest logs that are explicitly deemed non-sensitive by system owners, even if this significantly reduces the overall visibility into potential security incidents. The correct answer is C. Immediately implement granular role-based access controls for all ingested logs to restrict access to sensitive customer and financial data, assuming that security controls will mitigate privacy risks. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployments where the initial configuration, driven by a perceived need for immediate visibility, overlooks critical data privacy and regulatory compliance requirements. The pressure to demonstrate value quickly can lead to the ingestion of sensitive data without proper anonymization or access controls, creating a significant risk of noncompliance with data protection laws. The professional challenge lies in balancing the operational need for comprehensive logging with the legal and ethical obligations to protect personal and sensitive information. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a phased deployment that includes a thorough data classification and anonymization strategy before full data ingestion. This aligns with the principles of data minimization and privacy by design, which are fundamental to many data protection regulations. By identifying sensitive data types early and implementing appropriate anonymization techniques, e.g., tokenization, pseudonymization, or access controls, the organization ensures that only necessary and appropriately protected data is logged. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of regulatory violations, such as those outlined in GDPR or similar frameworks, by preventing the unauthorized processing or exposure of personal data. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible data handling and builds trust with stakeholders. Incorrect approaches analysis. Ingesting all available logs without prior classification and anonymization, assuming that security controls will be applied later, represents a significant regulatory failure. This approach violates the principle of data minimization and privacy by design, as it indiscriminately collects potentially sensitive data. If this data is later breached or accessed inappropriately, the organization would be in direct violation of data protection laws, facing potential fines and reputational damage. Implementing strict access controls to all ingested logs as a primary security measure, without addressing the initial ingestion of sensitive data, is also problematic. While access control is crucial, it does not rectify the fundamental issue of collecting and storing sensitive information unnecessarily. If the data itself is not protected at the source or during ingestion, even strict access controls can be circumvented or prove insufficient in the event of a broader system compromise. This approach fails to adhere to the principle of data minimization and may still lead to regulatory scrutiny for overcollection of personal data. Focusing solely on threat detection capabilities without considering the nature of the data being analyzed is a common oversight. While QRadar's strength lies in threat detection, its deployment must be guided by a comprehensive data governance framework. Ignoring the privacy implications of the data ingested for threat analysis can lead to the unintentional exposure or misuse of sensitive information, creating a regulatory liability. This approach prioritizes technical functionality over legal and ethical responsibilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, compliance-first approach to SIEM deployment. This involves a structured process that begins with understanding the organization's data landscape and relevant regulatory obligations. Key steps include: 1. Data classification. Identify and categorize all data sources and the types of information they contain, paying close attention to personal and sensitive data. 2. Regulatory assessment. Determine which data protection laws and regulations apply to the organization and the data being collected. 3. Privacy by design. Integrate privacy considerations into the SIEM architecture and data ingestion strategy from the outset. This includes implementing anonymization, pseudonymization, or tokenization where appropriate. 4. Access control strategy. Define granular access controls based on roles and responsibilities, ensuring that only authorized personnel can access specific types of data. 5. Phased deployment. Roll out QRadar in stages, starting with less sensitive data sources and gradually incorporating more, with continuous validation of compliance measures. 6. Ongoing monitoring and auditing. Regularly review data handling practices, access logs, and compliance posture to ensure continued adherence to regulations. This systematic approach ensures that the SIEM deployment not only enhances security posture, but also upholds legal and ethical standards for data protection. Question 12. Operational review demonstrates that the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3 deployment is experiencing significant performance degradation and high storage utilization shortly after initial go-live. The security team is under pressure to demonstrate immediate value and has been collecting logs from nearly every available source within the network. What is the most appropriate course of action to address these issues while ensuring effective security monitoring and compliance? Option A. Focus on tuning QRadar's correlation rules to better handle the high volume of events, assuming that the current log collection strategy is optimal for security visibility. Option B. Increase the storage capacity and processing power of the QRadar infrastructure to accommodate the current volume of logs, assuming that more data will inherently lead to better security. Option C. Immediately disable all non-essential log sources to reduce the immediate load on QRadar, without a formal review of their security relevance, to stabilize performance. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of all onboarded log sources, prioritizing those that directly support critical security use cases and regulatory compliance requirements, and reconfigure QRadar to ingest only these prioritized logs, deferring less critical sources for later optimization. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of all onboarded log sources, prioritizing those that directly support critical security use cases and regulatory compliance requirements, and reconfigure QRadar to ingest only these prioritized logs, deferring less critical sources for later optimization. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployments, balancing the need for comprehensive log collection with the practical constraints of storage, processing power, and network bandwidth. The professional challenge lies in making informed decisions about log source prioritization that align with both technical feasibility and regulatory compliance requirements. Without a clear understanding of which logs are critical for security monitoring and incident response, an organization risks either missing vital security events or incurring unnecessary operational costs. The pressure to demonstrate immediate value from the QRadar deployment can also lead to rushed decisions, exacerbating the risk of suboptimal configuration. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, risk-based prioritization of log sources. This aligns with best practices in security operations and is implicitly supported by various regulatory frameworks that mandate effective monitoring and incident response. By focusing on log sources that provide the highest security value, those directly related to threat detection, compliance auditing, and incident investigation, the organization ensures that QRadar is optimally configured to meet its primary security objectives. This approach minimizes the risk of overlooking critical security events while managing resource utilization efficiently. It demonstrates a mature understanding of security principles and a commitment to effective risk management, which are often underlying expectations in security audits and compliance assessments. Incorrect approaches analysis. Collecting all available logs without a defined strategy is professionally unsound because it leads to inefficient resource utilization, increased noise, and a higher likelihood of missing critical alerts due to alert fatigue. This approach fails to demonstrate a risk-based methodology, which is often a de facto requirement for effective security programs. It can also lead to significant, unplanned infrastructure costs, potentially violating budgetary controls and demonstrating poor financial stewardship. Prioritizing log sources solely based on ease of integration or vendor recommendations, without considering their security relevance, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach neglects the fundamental purpose of a SIEM, which is to enhance security posture. It can result in the exclusion of logs crucial for detecting specific threats or fulfilling compliance obligations, leaving the organization vulnerable and non-compliant. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence in configuring a critical security tool, focusing exclusively on logs that generate the most events, regardless of their security significance, is another flawed approach. High event volume does not equate to high security value. This can lead to overwhelming the SIEM with low-priority data, masking genuine threats and consuming valuable processing resources that could be used for more critical security analysis. This approach prioritizes quantity over quality, undermining the effectiveness of the SIEM and potentially leading to missed incidents, which is a direct failure in security monitoring responsibilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a phased approach to log source onboarding. This begins with identifying critical security use cases and regulatory requirements. Next, a risk assessment should be performed to determine which log sources are most relevant to these use cases and requirements. This assessment should consider the potential impact of a security incident and the likelihood of detection with specific log data. Following this, a pilot phase can be implemented to test the integration and value of prioritized log sources. Continuous monitoring and tuning of the SIEM configuration are essential to adapt to evolving threats and business needs. This structured, risk-informed decision-making process ensures that the SIEM deployment is effective, efficient, and compliant. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a significant number of low-impact, high-frequency security events alongside a smaller number of high-impact, moderate-frequency events. Given the operational constraints of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4, 3, which approach to event ingestion and analysis best aligns with a robust and compliant security posture? Option A. To prioritize the ingestion of high-impact, moderate-frequency events to conserve QRadar resources, focusing solely on the most frequent low-impact events. Option B. Prioritize the ingestion and detailed analysis of high-impact, moderate-frequency events, while implementing a tiered approach for lower-impact events based on their frequency and potential for correlation with other security indicators. Option C. Ingest all available security logs without initial prioritization, relying on QRadar's default correlation rules to identify significant threats amidst the data volume. Option D. Focus exclusively on ingesting and analyzing the highest frequency events, as these represent the most immediate and constant threat to the organization's operational environment. The correct answer is B. Prioritize the ingestion and detailed analysis of high-impact, moderate-frequency events, while implementing a tiered approach for lower-impact events based on their frequency and potential for correlation with other security indicators. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployment, balancing the need for comprehensive threat detection with the practical constraints of resource allocation and potential for alert fatigue. The organization is facing a critical decision regarding the prioritization of security events for ingestion and analysis within IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4, 3. The risk matrix, a standard tool for risk assessment, highlights a disparity between the potential impact of certain threats and the current detection capabilities. The professional challenge lies in making an informed decision that aligns with the organization's security posture, regulatory obligations, and operational efficiency, without succumbing to the temptation of either overinvesting in low-impact events or underinvesting in high-impact, albeit less frequent, threats. The correct approach involves a nuanced understanding of QRadar's capabilities and a strategic alignment with the organization's risk appetite and compliance requirements. Prioritizing the ingestion and detailed analysis of events that pose the highest potential impact, even if their likelihood is moderate, is crucial. This aligns with a proactive security strategy that focuses on mitigating significant risks. For instance, events that could lead to substantial financial loss, reputational damage, or regulatory noncompliance should be given precedence. This approach ensures that QRadar is effectively utilized to address the most critical threats, thereby maximizing the return on investment in the SIEM solution and demonstrating due diligence in protecting sensitive data and systems. This aligns with general principles of information security risk management, which emphasize addressing risks based on their potential impact. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the frequency of events, irrespective of their potential impact. For example, ingesting and analyzing a high volume of low severity, low-impact events might consume significant QRadar resources, processing power, storage, without providing commensurate security value. This could lead to alert fatigue, where security analysts become desensitized to genuine threats due to the sheer volume of noise. This approach fails to address the core purpose of a SIEM, which is to provide actionable intelligence on significant security incidents. It also represents a potential failure in resource management and could indirectly impact the ability to detect more critical, albeit less frequent, events. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss events with moderate likelihood and high impact simply because they are not the most frequent. This demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking and a failure to adequately consider the organization's risk tolerance. Regulatory frameworks often mandate that organizations take reasonable steps to protect sensitive information, and ignoring high-impact threats, even if they occur less often, could be seen as a dereliction of this duty. This approach prioritizes short-term operational ease over long-term security resilience. A third incorrect approach might be to indiscriminately ingest all available logs without proper tuning or prioritization. This leads to an overwhelming amount of data, making it difficult to identify meaningful security events. It also incurs unnecessary costs related to storage and processing, and significantly increases the risk of missing critical incidents due to the sheer volume of irrelevant information. This approach is inefficient and ineffective, failing to leverage QRadar's analytical capabilities to their full potential. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, considering both the likelihood and impact of various security events. This assessment should be informed by the organization's specific threat landscape, business objectives, and regulatory obligations. Subsequently, QRadar's capabilities and limitations should be evaluated in the context of this risk assessment. A phased approach to log source onboarding and rule tuning, prioritizing high-impact events and gradually incorporating lower-impact ones as resources allow, is a sound strategy. Continuous monitoring and refinement of QRadar's configuration based on evolving threats and organizational needs are also essential for maintaining an effective security posture. Question 14. During the evaluation of IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 deployment for a U.S.-based financial services institution, a critical decision point arises regarding the configuration of log data retention policies. The primary objective is to ensure comprehensive security monitoring and effective incident response capabilities, while strictly adhering to relevant U.S. federal and state regulations concerning data privacy and auditability. Which of the following approaches best balances these requirements? Option A. Set a uniform, short retention period for all log data across the SIEM to minimize storage expenses and simplify management, assuming that any critical events will be flagged and addressed within that time frame. Option B. Configure QRadar to retain all ingested log data indefinitely to ensure maximum forensic capability for any future investigation, regardless of storage costs or potential privacy implications. Option C. Rely solely on the default QRadar log retention settings without conducting a specific analysis of the institution's regulatory obligations or data types, assuming these defaults are universally compliant. Option D. Implement a tiered log retention strategy based on data sensitivity, regulatory mandates, and forensic investigation needs, archiving or purging less critical logs after a defined period, while retaining critical security event logs for extended durations on appropriate storage tiers. The correct answer is D. Implement a tiered log retention strategy based on data sensitivity, regulatory mandates, and forensic investigation needs, archiving or purging less critical logs after a defined period, while retaining critical security event logs for extended durations on appropriate storage tiers. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the immediate need for threat detection with the long-term implications of data privacy and regulatory compliance. Organizations deploying IBM Security QRadar SIEM must navigate the complexities of data retention policies, which are often dictated by a combination of legal requirements, industry best practices, and internal risk tolerance. The challenge lies in configuring QRadar to meet these diverse demands without compromising security effectiveness or incurring unnecessary storage costs. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, which in the context of U.S.-based organizations would include regulations like HIPAA for healthcare data, PCI DSS for payment card data, and potentially state-specific data breach notification laws. It also necessitates an analysis of the organization's specific risk profile and business needs to determine appropriate retention periods for different types of log data. Implementing a tiered storage strategy, where frequently accessed or critical logs are retained for longer periods on faster storage, and less critical logs are archived or purged sooner, represents best professional practice. This approach ensures that QRadar can effectively support incident response and forensic investigations while remaining compliant with data privacy mandates and managing storage efficiently. An incorrect approach would be to adopt a blanket retention policy for all log data, either too short or too long. A retention period that is too short risks noncompliance with regulatory requirements for audit trails and incident investigation, potentially leading to significant fines and reputational damage. Conversely, retaining all logs indefinitely or for excessively long periods without a clear justification can lead to escalating storage costs, performance degradation of the SIEM, and increased exposure to data privacy risks if a breach occurs. Furthermore, failing to document and justify the chosen retention policies, or not aligning them with legal counsel's advice, constitutes a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the legal obligations surrounding data handling. Professionals should approach this decision by first identifying all applicable regulations and legal obligations. This should be followed by an internal risk assessment to understand the value and sensitivity of different data sources. Consulting with legal and compliance teams is paramount to ensure that proposed retention policies are legally sound. The configuration within QRadar should then be tailored to implement these policies, potentially leveraging features like data lifecycle management and tiered storage. Regular reviews and audits of the retention policies and their implementation are crucial to adapt to evolving regulations and business needs. Question 15. The assessment process reveals that a newly deployed IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 instance is experiencing significant performance degradation and rapidly increasing storage utilization. The initial deployment configuration involved enabling logging from a broad spectrum of network devices, applications, and endpoints without a detailed analysis of the security relevance or compliance requirements for each log source. Which of the following approaches to log source management would best address these issues while maintaining effective security monitoring capabilities? Option A. Implement a phased approach to log source onboarding, prioritizing critical security events and compliance-relevant logs, and then systematically evaluate and onboard additional log sources based on their demonstrated value and impact on QRadar performance and storage. Option B. Rely on the default log source configurations provided by IBM for QRadar v7.4.3, assuming these defaults are optimized for all deployment scenarios and security needs. Option C. Configure QRadar to retain all collected logs indefinitely to ensure no historical data is lost, and invest in additional storage hardware to accommodate the growing data volume. Option D. Immediately disable logging for all non-essential applications and endpoints to reduce data volume, focusing only on network device logs and critical server logs as defined by basic security best practices. The correct answer is A. Implement a phased approach to log source onboarding, prioritizing critical security events and compliance-relevant logs, and then systematically evaluate and onboard additional log sources based on their demonstrated value and impact on QRadar performance and storage. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in SIEM deployments, balancing the need for comprehensive threat detection with the operational realities of data volume and retention policies. In the context of the C1000-140 exam, which focuses on IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 deployment, understanding how to effectively manage log sources and their associated data is paramount. This scenario is professionally challenging because an improper configuration can lead to either missed security events due to insufficient logging or excessive storage costs and performance degradation due to overlogging. Careful judgment is required to align technical capabilities with business requirements and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the collection of logs that are essential for security monitoring, incident response, and compliance auditing, while intelligently excluding low-value or redundant data. This aligns with the principle of least privilege applied to data collection, ensuring that QRadar is optimized for its core security functions. By focusing on critical log sources and leveraging QRadar's capabilities for intelligent filtering and normalization, organizations can achieve effective threat detection without unnecessary overhead. This approach is ethically sound, as it ensures resources are used efficiently to protect the organization's assets and data. An incorrect approach that involves collecting all available logs without discrimination represents a failure to adhere to principles of efficient resource management and potentially violates data minimization principles inherent in many data privacy regulations. This can lead to increased costs, slower QRadar performance, and a needle in a haystack problem for security analysts, hindering effective incident detection and response. Collecting only logs that are explicitly required by a specific compliance mandate, while seemingly efficient, is also an incorrect approach if it excludes logs vital for broader threat detection and proactive security measures not directly covered by a narrow compliance scope. This can lead to a false sense of security and leave the organization vulnerable to threats outside the defined compliance perimeter. An approach that relies solely on vendor defaults without a thorough assessment of organizational needs and risks is also professionally deficient, as it fails to tailor the SIEM solution to the unique threat landscape and operational environment of the deploying organization. This can result in a system that is either overconfigured and inefficient or underconfigured and ineffective. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment and understanding of business objectives. This involves identifying critical assets, potential threats, and regulatory requirements. Subsequently, a detailed inventory of potential log sources should be compiled, and each source should be evaluated based on its security value, relevance to compliance, and potential impact on QRadar performance and storage. This evaluation should lead to a prioritized list of log sources for collection, with a clear strategy for tuning and filtering to maximize the value of the collected data. Regular review and refinement of the logging strategy are essential to adapt to evolving threats and business needs. Question 16. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant increase in the volume of raw log data being processed by IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3, leading to increased processing load and potential delays in alert generation. This surge is attributed to the recent enablement of several new log sources without a corresponding tuning of correlation rules or an assessment of their security relevance. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while adhering to best practices for security monitoring and compliance? Option A. Increase the processing capacity of the QRadar deployment to accommodate the increased log volume, assuming all enabled logs are necessary for comprehensive security coverage. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment and data relevance analysis for each newly enabled log source, prioritizing their re-enablement and tuning based on their criticality to threat detection and compliance requirements. Option C. Immediately disable all newly enabled log sources to reduce the processing load and revert to the previous operational state. Option D. Implement a generic event suppression policy across all log sources to reduce the volume of processed events, without specific analysis of individual log source contributions. The correct answer is C. Immediately disable all newly enabled log sources to reduce the processing load and revert to the previous operational state. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a critical need for effective log source management, particularly concerning the ingestion and correlation of security events. In a regulated environment like the one governed by the C1000-140 IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 deployment exam, which implicitly aligns with U.S. regulatory frameworks such as NIST Cybersecurity Framework and potentially PCI DSS for payment card data, maintaining the integrity and completeness of security logs is paramount. The challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive visibility with the operational overhead and potential for noise introduced by excessive or irrelevant log data. Professionals must make informed decisions about which log sources to prioritize, how to configure their collection, and how to tune correlation rules to ensure that critical security events are not obscured. The correct approach involves a systematic and risk-based methodology for log source onboarding and tuning. This means prioritizing log sources that are critical to detecting threats relevant to the organization's assets and compliance obligations. It requires a deep understanding of the data each log source provides, its potential value in detecting security incidents, and its impact on QRadar's performance and licensing. Best professional practice dictates a phased approach: initial enablement of high-priority sources, followed by rigorous tuning of rules and event processors to reduce false positives and ensure timely detection of genuine threats. This aligns with the principle of least privilege applied to data ingestion, ensuring that only necessary and valuable data is processed, thereby optimizing security posture and resource utilization. An incorrect approach would be to enable all available log sources indiscriminately without proper assessment. This leads to a data deluge, where valuable security events are buried under a mountain of noise, increasing the likelihood of missed detections and delaying incident response. This failure can have significant regulatory implications. For instance, under NIST, organizations are expected to have effective detection capabilities, which are compromised by an unmanaged log environment. If the organization handles payment card data, a failure to adequately monitor and detect security events related to cardholder data could lead to PCI DSS noncompliance, resulting in fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to disable log sources without a clear understanding of their potential security value or regulatory requirements. This can create blind spots in the security monitoring, leaving the organization vulnerable to threats that might have been detected by those specific logs. Ethically, this represents a failure to uphold the duty of care to protect organizational assets and sensitive data. The professional decision-making process should involve a thorough risk assessment for each potential log source. This assessment should consider the asset criticality, the type of data generated, its relevance to known threats, and any specific regulatory mandates. Following this, a pilot or phased rollout of selected log sources should be implemented, with continuous monitoring and tuning of QRadar's correlation rules and event processing. Regular reviews of log source effectiveness and relevance are crucial to adapt to evolving threat landscapes and business requirements. Question 17. Regulatory review indicates that an organization utilizing IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4, 3 is subject to data retention mandates that vary based on the sensitivity of the logged event. To ensure compliance and effective incident response, which of the following log retention strategies for QRadar is most aligned with these varying regulatory requirements? Option A. Implement a tiered log retention policy within QRadar, categorizing logs based on event sensitivity and applying distinct retention periods for each category as dictated by applicable regulations and risk assessments. Option B. Adopt a uniform log retention period across all log sources within QRadar, set to the shortest duration mandated by any single applicable regulation, to simplify management. Option C. Configure QRadar to retain all logs indefinitely to ensure maximum data availability for any potential future investigation, regardless of event sensitivity or specific regulatory requirements. Option D. Rely solely on the default log retention settings provided by IBM for QRadar v7. 4. 3. Assuming these defaults are universally compliant with all relevant industry and governmental regulations. The correct answer is A. Implement a tiered log retention policy within QRadar, categorizing logs based on event sensitivity and applying distinct retention periods for each category as dictated by applicable regulations and risk assessments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for comprehensive security monitoring with the practical constraints of data storage and regulatory compliance. The core difficulty lies in determining the appropriate retention period for security logs, which must satisfy both the organization's incident response capabilities and the specific requirements of relevant regulations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7, 4, 3 deployments logging capabilities, and how they align with the chosen regulatory framework. Best professional practice dictates a risk-based approach, where log retention policies are informed by the potential impact of security incidents, the likelihood of their occurrence, and the legal or contractual obligations for evidence preservation. This ensures that critical security data is available for forensic analysis and compliance audits without incurring unnecessary storage costs or violating data privacy laws. An incorrect approach would be to adopt a blanket retention policy without considering the specific types of logs generated by QRadar or the nuances of the applicable regulations. For instance, retaining all logs indefinitely could lead to excessive storage costs and potential data privacy violations if sensitive information is kept longer than necessary. Conversely, retaining logs for too short a period might render them useless for incident investigation or compliance purposes, exposing the organization to significant risks. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on vendor recommendations without validating them against specific regulatory mandates, as vendor defaults may not always align with legal requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable regulatory requirements related to log retention. This should be followed by an assessment of the types of security events QRadar is configured to monitor and the criticality of the data associated with those events. Subsequently, a risk assessment should be conducted to determine the potential impact of an incident and the need for historical log data. Finally, a log retention policy should be developed and documented, clearly defining retention periods for different log categories, and this policy should be regularly reviewed and updated to reflect changes in regulations or organizational risk posture. Question 18. The audit findings indicate that the current IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7.4.3 deployment may be logging an excessive amount of sensitive user information, potentially increasing the risk of data exposure and noncompliance with data privacy regulations. Which of the following approaches best addresses this audit finding while adhering to best practices for security and data protection? Option A. Continue logging all available data fields to ensure maximum visibility for security investigations, assuming that QRadar's inherent security features are sufficient to protect the data. Option B. Configure QRadar to selectively log only the essential fields required for security event analysis, redacting or excluding highly sensitive data elements that do not directly contribute to threat detection. Option C. Disable logging for all fields identified as containing sensitive user information to minimize the risk of data exposure. Option D. Implement a comprehensive data masking solution external to QRadar that processes all logs before they are ingested. The correct answer is B. Configure QRadar to selectively log only the essential fields required for security event analysis, redacting or excluding highly sensitive data elements that do not directly contribute to threat detection. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential gap in how sensitive data is being logged and protected within the QRadar SIEM deployment. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for comprehensive security monitoring with data privacy regulations and the operational impact of excessive logging. The chosen approach must align with the specific regulatory framework governing data handling and security in the deployment's jurisdiction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the audit finding by implementing a targeted and risk-based strategy for sensitive data logging. This involves identifying what constitutes sensitive data according to relevant regulations, e.g., PI, financial data, health information, and then configuring QRadar to log only the necessary fields for security analysis, while redacting or excluding highly sensitive, non-essential data. This minimizes the risk of data breaches related to log data itself, ensures compliance with data minimization principles often found in privacy laws, and reduces storage and processing overhead. It demonstrates a proactive and compliant approach to security information and event management. An incorrect approach that involves logging all data without discrimination fails to adhere to data minimization principles, potentially violating privacy regulations by collecting and storing more sensitive information than is strictly necessary for security purposes. This increases the attack surface and the potential impact of a log data compromise. Another incorrect approach, which is to disable logging for all sensitive data fields, is professionally unacceptable because it creates blind spots in security monitoring. This directly contradicts the purpose of a SIEM system, which is to detect and respond to threats. Such an approach would likely lead to missed security incidents, making the organization vulnerable and failing to meet its security obligations. A third incorrect approach, relying solely on external data masking tools without integrating them into the QRadar logging configuration, is insufficient. While external tools might offer some protection, they do not address the fundamental issue of what is being ingested and stored within the SIEM itself, leaving the log data itself potentially exposed and failing to achieve a comprehensive, integrated security posture. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements for data logging and privacy in their jurisdiction. This should be followed by a thorough risk assessment to identify sensitive data types and their relevance to security monitoring. The next step involves consulting QRadar's capabilities for fine-grained logging control, including field-level logging and data masking/redaction features. The chosen solution should then be validated against both security objectives and regulatory compliance, with ongoing monitoring and periodic review to ensure continued effectiveness and adherence to evolving regulations. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that organizations operating under strict U.S. federal regulations, such as those governing financial services or healthcare, often face complex challenges in deploying a centralized SIEM solution like IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. Due to data residency and privacy mandates. Considering these constraints, which of the following deployment strategies best addresses the need for comprehensive security monitoring while adhering to stringent regulatory requirements? Option A. Relying solely on endpoint security solutions and network intrusion detection systems to monitor for threats, assuming that QRadar's centralized logging capabilities are not essential for meeting regulatory compliance in a distributed operational environment. Option B. Utilizing QRadar's cloud-based SaaS offering without first verifying if the cloud provider's data centers meet the specific data residency requirements mandated by the organizations governing U.S. federal regulations. Option C. Implementing a distributed QRadar architecture where specific event processors and log sources are strategically located within defined geographic or regulatory zones to ensure that sensitive data is processed and stored only in compliant locations, with appropriate data flow controls between zones. Option D. Deploying QRadar components, including event processors and the console, in a single, geographically centralized location to simplify management and reduce latency for all log sources, irrespective of their origin or data sensitivity. The correct answer is D. Deploying QRadar components, including event processors and the console, in a single geographically centralized location to simplify management and reduce latency for all log sources, irrespective of their origin or data sensitivity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in SIEM deployments where the organization is subject to specific data residency and privacy regulation, such as those enforced by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, for financial institutions, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, for healthcare organizations. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for centralized security monitoring and analysis with the strict legal and regulatory requirements that dictate where sensitive data can be stored and processed. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to severe financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. The decision-making process requires a deep understanding of both the technical capabilities of QRadar and the nuances of applicable legal frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the data residency requirements and designing the QRadar deployment to comply. This means identifying sensitive data sources, understanding where that data can be legally processed and stored, and configuring QRadar accordingly. For instance, if regulations mandate that protected health information, FI, must remain within the United States, the QRadar deployment must ensure that logs containing PHI are ingested, processed, and stored on QRadar components located within the U.S. This might involve deploying QRadar event processors and QRadar console instances in specific geographic regions, or implementing data masking and anonymization techniques before data leaves a regulated zone. This approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes legal compliance and data protection, which are paramount in regulated industries. It demonstrates a proactive and risk-aware security posture, ensuring that the SIEM solution enhances security without introducing regulatory noncompliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to assume that all log data can be sent to a single, centralized QRadar console, regardless of its origin or the regulatory implications of its content. This fails to acknowledge data residency laws, potentially leading to the unauthorized transfer of sensitive data across jurisdictional boundaries. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it directly violates laws like HIPAA or GDPR, if applicable to the data type, though the exam context is US-centric. Another incorrect approach is to implement data masking or anonymization universally for all log sources without a clear understanding of which data actually requires such protection due to regulatory mandates. While anonymization can be a useful technique, Applying it indiscriminately can strip valuable forensic data needed for incident investigation, thereby undermining the primary purpose of the SIEM. This is an operational and effectiveness failure, and if it leads to an inability to comply with audit or investigation requirements mandated by regulations, it becomes a regulatory failure as well. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the specific data types and their associated regulatory requirements, opting for a generic QRadar deployment strategy. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to understand the organization's specific compliance obligations. It risks storing or processing regulated data in non-compliant ways, leading to potential legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, starting with a comprehensive understanding of all applicable regulations, e.g., HIPAA, PCI DSS, SOX, state-specific privacy laws that govern the data the organization handles. This understanding should then inform the design and configuration of the QRadar SIEM. Key steps include 1. Data classification. Identify and classify all data sources based on sensitivity and regulatory requirements. 2. Regulatory mapping. Map data classifications to specific legal and regulatory obligations, particularly concerning data residency, processing, and storage. 3. QRadar architecture design. Design the QRadar deployment, e.g., distributed deployment, regional collectors, console placement, to align with these regulatory constraints. 4. Configuration and policy implementation. Configure QRadar to enforce data handling policies, including access controls, data retention, and potentially data masking where legally mandated. 5. Continuous monitoring and auditing. Regularly audit the QRadar deployment and its data handling practices to ensure ongoing compliance. Question 20. Implementation of a comprehensive log collection strategy for IBM Security QRadar SIEM v7. 4. 3. Considering the need to detect a wide range of potential security threats while managing system resources and storage costs requires careful consideration of which log sources and event types to prioritize. Option A. Prioritize log collection from critical assets and security-relevant event types that directly support threat detection and incident response, based on a risk assessment. Option B. Focus on collecting logs from the least expensive storage options, regardless of their security relevance, to optimize operational expenditure. Option C. Enable logging for all available event types and sources to ensure maximum visibility, and then implement data retention policies to manage storage. Option D. Only enable logging for event types that are explicitly mandated by specific cybersecurity regulations to minimize data volume and associated costs. The correct answer is C. Enable logging for all available event types and sources to ensure maximum visibility, and then implement data retention policies to manage storage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for comprehensive security monitoring with the practical constraints of resource allocation and potential impact on network performance. The core of the challenge lies in determining the optimal scope and granularity of log collection for IBM Security QRadar SIEM, ensuring that critical security events are captured without overwhelming the system or incurring unnecessary costs. Careful judgment is required to align technical capabilities with organizational risk appetite and regulatory compliance requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the collection of logs that are directly relevant to detecting and responding to security threats, as mandated by general cybersecurity best practices and implied by the need for effective incident response. This approach involves a risk-based assessment, focusing on high-value assets and critical security functions. By selectively enabling logging for specific event types and sources that pose the greatest risk, organizations can achieve effective security visibility while optimizing QRadar's performance and storage utilization. This aligns with the principle of proportionality in security controls, ensuring that resources are applied where they are most effective in mitigating risk. An incorrect approach that involves enabling logging for all possible event types without prior analysis is professionally unacceptable. This would lead to excessive data volume, increasing storage costs, straining QRadar's processing capabilities, and potentially obscuring critical security events within a sea of noise. This indiscriminate logging fails to demonstrate due diligence in resource management and could be seen as a failure to implement a risk-based security program, potentially violating organizational policies and best practices for efficient security operation. Another incorrect approach, which is to disable logging for any event type that is not explicitly mandated by a specific regulation, is also professionally flawed. Regulatory compliance is important. A comprehensive security posture requires monitoring beyond minimum regulatory requirements. This approach neglects potential threats that may not be directly covered by specific regulations, but still pose a significant risk to the organization. It demonstrates a reactive rather than proactive security mindset and could lead to misdetection of novel or evolving threats, leaving the organization vulnerable. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on the lowest cost of storage without considering the security value of the logs, is professionally unsound. Security monitoring is an investment, not just an expense. Prioritizing cost savings over the ability to detect and respond to security incidents is a direct abdication of security responsibility. This approach would likely result in insufficient visibility, hindering incident response, and potentially leading to greater financial and reputational damage in the event of a breach. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment. This includes identifying critical assets and data, understanding potential threats and vulnerabilities, and evaluating the likelihood and impact of security incidents. Based on this assessment, organizations should define their security monitoring objectives and then select log sources and event types that best support these objectives. Regular review and tuning of logging policies are essential to adapt to evolving threats and organizational changes. This iterative process ensures that QRadar is configured to provide maximum security value within practical constraints.